Good morning, everybody. I want to thank Jill very much for this invitation and to the ITER Institute for having me out here. It's a real honor to be here with such a distinguished roster of participants, including somewhere out here Ambassador John Weeks of Canada, who I think has forgotten more about trade than I've ever known. So I'm really pleased to be here. What I hope I will be able to bring to you all here this morning is a perspective from many years of watching U.S. trade policy very closely, not as a negotiator or as a lobbyist, but I hope as a reasonably objective outside observer. I was lucky enough to be hired as a young reporter many years ago for a detailed-oriented newsletter called Inside U.S. Trade in Washington, D.C. at a time when the United States was in the middle of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA negotiations, and in the middle of the Uruguay round negotiations, creating the deals that remain the template today for the modern trade system. Secretary Yiter, of course, played a big role in both negotiations as U.S. Trade Representative and as Secretary of Agriculture. I'm sorry to say that my first boss, the great Una Hennig, would not let novice reporters like me cover the agricultural negotiation. She said it was far too complicated and that only she could do it. I still fortunately got a ringside seat to a whole bunch of other great stories, such as the big U.S.-Japan trade disputes of the early 1990s. The Clinton administration, go back many years, had threatened to put 100% tariffs on $6 billion worth of Japanese luxury auto imports, Nexus, Infiniti, all those fancy cars. This was, even by modern standards, a very heated dispute. I'll just tell you one story from my reporting days. In the middle of this dispute in the summer of 1995, the Japanese trade minister and the U.S. trade representative met as part of a group with the Canadian trade minister and the European trade minister up at Whistler, British Columbia, just outside of Vancouver, which is where I grew up. And at the end of these negotiations, they had a press conference. It was a room a little like this with a bigger stage at the front. And the U.S. Trade Representative, Mickey Cantor, sat on one far side of the stage, and the Japanese Trade Minister, Hashimoto, on the other far side of the stage with the Canadian Roy McLaren and the EU official Leon Britton in between. And they were sitting on opposite sides of the stage, glaring at each other. And I'm listening through the translation as Hashimoto is speaking. And the translator says in my little earpiece, negotiating with Mickey Cantor is scarier than facing my wife when I come home after a night of drinking. I turned to my Japanese reporter friends. I said, did he really say that? And they're like, yeah. I will give Ambassador Cantor credit. He had a quick comeback. He immediately said, I'd like to hear your wife's side of the story. So trade was pretty hot even back then. I went on later to join the Financial Times, where I reported on the growing pains of the new WTO system with the addition of China in 2001, the often wrenching disputes between the U.S. and Europe over aircraft and taxes. Some things never change. And the failure of efforts to expand and update the global trade rules through the ill-fated Doha round. And then finally, in my work over a little more than a decade now at the Council on Foreign Relations, I've come to have a deeper understanding of really, I think they're correctly called the catastrophic failure of successive U.S. governments to deal with the distributional impacts of trade here in the United States, what I called in my 2016 book, those left behind by the global economy. But today, I don't really want to look back at all of that, except to the extent that those events hold some lessons for the present. Instead, I want to hazard some predictions about what I think might come next in U.S. trade policy. With the current president, I think we can all agree that is a risky endeavor. So please don't leave here and go and invest your retirement savings based on whatever I say. Past performance is no prediction of the future, as the investment advisors say. Okay, so the question I have posed for this talk, is uncertainty the only certainty, is not a reassuring one. If the answer to that question is yes, the implications for business, for agriculture, I would say for world politics, are enormous and discouraging. One way to look at the creation of the modern global trade system since the end of World War II is that it has been a steadily advancing effort to minimize uncertainty in global commerce. Much of what national governments do in the economic sphere is to reduce uncertainty. Governments enforce contracts, they manage currencies, they uphold intellectual property rights, they use interest rates to minimize swings in the economy, and in 100 other ways try to bring greater certainty to the inherent uncertainty of economic activity. This matters enormously. We have all heard, many of you in this room have probably said many times, that uncertainty is the enemy of business. Entrepreneurs and companies wanting to invest in a new product or service must have some degree of confidence in the rules. There's enough inherent risk in predicting economic or consumer trends that adding policy or legal uncertainty on top of that inevitably discourages risk-taking, it dampens investment, and harms both innovation and economic growth. The same is obviously true here in Nebraska's farm sector. There is such a high level of inherent uncertainty about weather and yields and market competition that adding policy uncertainty, whether it's new trade barriers or refiners suddenly getting large exemptions from ethanol requirements or those being undone as the case may be, all of this makes it all but impossible for farmers to manage their business successfully. International commerce has always had a much higher degree of uncertainty. That's one of the things that quite distinguishes international business from national business. There's uncertainty in both, but it's much higher internationally. There's no global currency. There's no binding global legal system. There's no court of last resort. The beggar thy neighbor measures of the 1930s, which we've all learned about, in which the world's leading economies raced against each other to impose discriminatory tariffs and devalue their currencies in a futile quest for competitive advantage, showed us the danger of unconstrained economic nationalism. I mean, from 1929 to 1932, trade among the industrialized nations fell by 30%. Economic nationalism brings bad things. The history of the post-World War II negotiations should be seen as a progressively expanding effort, under U.S. leadership, I might add, to constrain harmful economic nationalism, to create a set of agreed rules and norms that would bring greater certainty to anyone wanting to do business across international borders. The effort started, as you all know, in the initial negotiations in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, with reciprocal tariff reductions, initially involving about 24 of the world's leading economies in the late 40s and 1950s. Over the decades, more and more countries joined in, and the negotiations tried to narrow further the areas of policy uncertainty and create the proverbial level playing field. These measures included restricting government subsidies to business and to farmers, eliminating the use of quotas to restrict trade, creating rules for government purchases, restricting the use of the trade remedy measures that you learned about this morning, anti-dumping and other domestic measures for blocking imports, and protecting intellectual property. Ultimately, of course, this led to the most ambitious step of all, which was the creation in 1995 of binding rules for resolving disputes through the World Trade Organization. Perhaps the closest thing human beings have ever created, I will emphasize that, perhaps the closest thing human beings have ever created to a genuine international court. By any reasonable set of measures, the post-World War II effort to minimize uncertainty in trade was extraordinarily successful. World trade grew tenfold between 1950 and 1980, and then grew by an astonishing 35 times between 1980 and 2010. From 1980 to 2016, the total stock of foreign direct investment grew from about $700 billion to more than $25 trillion. All of this brought real benefits to people across the world, in the 2 decades leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, more people were brought out of poverty across the world than in any other comparable period in human history. It's a tremendous set of accomplishments. I hesitate, therefore, to suggest that history will treat the WTO much the way it now treats Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, as an inherently utopian project that was doomed to fail. Certainly the WTO's track record is far better, and there is an argument to be made that international economic cooperation is easier than international security cooperation. But the WTO may not end up lasting much longer than the ill-fated League. It turns out to be tremendously difficult to persuade nations, especially big and powerful ones, like the United States and China, to tie their hands to a set of international rules. The incentive to break free and try to get better outcomes through coercing smaller, weaker nations is always present. I was lucky enough as a graduate student at Berkeley many years ago to have the opportunity to study with two of the giants of international relations theory, who were more or less on opposite sides of this issue. Kenneth Waltz saw international relations through the prism of national power. And he believed that the only way to achieve some stability and greater certainty in world politics was through a balance of power among otherwise suspicious or antagonistic nations. Nations, he believed, were largely unwilling to cooperate except in short-term and tactical ways. The opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation were, he believed, modest at best. On the opposite side of that debate, I also studied with Ernst Haas, a German Jew who fled with his family to the United States in 1938, and who built his theories watching the post-World War II progress of the European community. He argued that countries would be willing to gradually cede some of their sovereignty, and over time more and more of their sovereignty, to these collective bodies if there were clear economic and other gains for their citizens from doing so. His theory was broadly called functionalism, that governments will do things that are functional for the well-being of their citizens. Sadly, neither is with us still. They both passed away some years ago. I would love to have asked Ken about former U.S. Trade Representative Bob Zellick's hope that a rising China would become a responsible stakeholder in a global system built under U.S. leadership. I suspect he would have been skeptical of that idea, to say the least. I can't even imagine what Ernie would say today watching the folly of Brexit. As you all know, what we are seeing today is a backlash, not in all places, but in some large and important ones, against the post-World War II project of building certainty through binding international rules. There are many ideas out there about the cause of this backlash. Mine tend to focus on the failures of domestic policy to mitigate the unequal impacts of growing trade. Simply speaking, trade very good for our large coastal cities and some large inland cities, much less good for smaller manufacturing-dependent places in the heartland. I argued in my book that the U.S. domestic response to globalization and the failure of political leaders to do more to help those on the losing end of globalization was deeply irresponsible. We are paying the price now for that irresponsibility. Others, like Danny Roderick of Harvard, argued that policymakers became too ambitious and ceded to the WTO and other trade arrangements powers that should have remained at the national level. And then obviously the 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath had enormous consequences, not least in undermining public faith in the expert class of policymakers who had made it their life's work to build these global trade and financial systems. So what has the backlash brought us so far? Many of you here know the big developments of the past 2 years, but let me just recount them briefly. It is sometimes easy to focus on the day-to-day and the next set of tariffs or the next round of negotiations and lose the forest for the trees. Let me talk about the forest for a little bit. From the WTO's launch in 1995 until the last year or so, its member nations, by and large, behaved with extraordinary fealty to the rules. It was certainly far from a perfect system. Many of the decisions took too long. Ronnie and I were talking about this last night. China put discriminatory tariffs on auto parts in the mid-2000s, blatantly discriminatory, 15% tariff on imported auto parts designed to prevent auto companies from just doing final assembly for the Chinese market in China, importing parts, assembling the cars and selling them into the Chinese market. Blatant violation of WTO rules. It was slapped down by the WTO, but it took about 2.5 years. And in those 2.5 years, a lot of parts companies had moved operations to China because they didn't want to lose out on the huge and growing Chinese market. China dragged its feet on other WTO rulings, including opening its market to foreign payments providers like MasterCard and Visa. China's finally sort of 8 years late doing it now, but nobody in China uses credit cards anymore. They pay everything on their phones through WeChat or other pay systems. So the U.S. has basically been frozen out of that market. United States, again, we were pretty good citizens, but in one case we decided to pay off Brazilian cotton farmers rather than comply with a WTO ruling to eliminate cotton subsidies. But most of the time, I mean, there have been hundreds and hundreds of WTO panel decisions. Most of the times, countries complied with the rulings in good faith. And the WTO was not alone in creating greater certainty. Despite the stalling of the Doha round negotiations, the United States and many others, including the EU, Mexico, and Canada, continued to negotiate new bilateral and regional trade agreements that pushed the envelope still further. These deals reached into new areas of commerce like digital trade, created greater harmony in regulatory systems, agricultural product standards, customs entry procedures, and restrictions on foreign investment. For decades, it was pretty easy to make a one-way bet that trade barriers were going to continue to drop and cross-border commerce was going to get easier and more predictable. Now let's consider what's happened since the start of 2017. President Trump, on his third day in office, pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a deal that was 10 years in the making and would have covered 40% of the global economy. This opened the door for increased Chinese influence in the region and has left the United States at a big competitive disadvantage that the recent partial deal on agriculture with Japan will only slightly fix. The United States slapped tariffs on steel and aluminum imports for many of its closest allies, including Canada, Mexico, Japan, Korea, and the European Union. And I'm going to be less polite than Professor Schaefer. It was done on a patently flimsy pretext that imports threaten U.S. national security. The WTO provisions on national security, and they are being debated, don't say you can wave the flag of national security and do whatever you want. They're actually quite restrictive in terms of when you can do it. I think the WTO panel will find that steel and aluminum tariffs were an egregious violation of that exception. Many of the countries targeted, the Europeans, Canada, and Mexico, retaliated in kind, largely by imposing tariffs on U.S. farm exports, even though no such retaliation was authorized by the WTO or any other trade agreement. So U.S. violates WTO, other parties violate it back. The United States has now imposed tariffs on China, covering all but about a third of China's $500 billion in annual exports to the United States. And you learned about the authority, Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. That happened, and if you go back through the legislative history, this is extremely clear. That happened even though the United States had explicitly committed, when it joined the WTO, to using the WTO's dispute resolution procedures rather than unilateral actions under Section 301, except in very limited cases, of which the action against China is clearly not one. China, in turn, retaliated against U.S. exports, again focusing on farm products, despite lacking any proper WTO authority to do so. The United States is continuing to threaten national security tariffs on imported automobiles, even though this would be an even more egregious violation than the steel and aluminum tariffs of the WTO's rather narrow security exemption. President Trump threatened again this summer to slap new tariffs on Mexican imports unless Mexico did more to control migration from Central America. There is nothing in any trade deal ever written anywhere in the world, including the WTO or NAFTA, or the new and still unratified USMCA, which permits such an action. The president threatened it anyway. And finally, this unilateralism is starting to spread. Japan and South Korea, for example, the world's third and 11th largest economies, are engaged in a WTO illegal tit-for-tat trade sanctions dispute over diplomatic differences that date back to the Second World War. To me, one of the most remarkable things about all of this is watching the way financial markets are gyrating based on the latest tidbits of trade news. Those of us who follow trade figures never seen the markets react this way to trade news. U.S.-China talks are going well. Dow goes up. The trade representative, Bob Lighthizer, walks out of the Winder building looking grumpy. The S&P tanks. They forget that Bob Lighthizer always looks grumpy. In an otherwise healthy economy, trade conflict has become the single biggest source of uncertainty. So, to the prediction question, does any of this get better? Or is this the new normal? I will wrap up by discussing 3 possible future scenarios, and then I'm happy to field questions. Let's start with the most worrying possibility, which is a deepening trade war. As I said, trade news has been moving the markets a lot. But if I had to sum up what the markets are telling us, they remain cautiously optimistic. Every time that the market has slumped when the U.S.-China talks break down or the president announces a new set of tariffs, it seems to have gradually recovered. Markets seem to be operating with some confidence that the U.S. tariffs are purely tactical and will be lifted once agreements are reached between the United States and its major trading partners, especially China. I think this is overly optimistic. We are more than a year now into the trade war with China, and there has been little progress towards an agreement. The issues on the table go to the heart of China's economic model. And the Chinese have not shown a willingness to offer much more than some modest concessions on market access, particularly in terms of farm products, and intellectual property protection, a little bit on access for U.S. financial services companies. The Chinese negotiators are in Washington as we speak for the latest round of negotiations. The reporting is all over the map. Bloomberg suggesting maybe there might be some mini deal involving purchases and a delay of tariffs. Politico reporting this morning that the Chinese negotiator is ready to pack up his bags and go home. So we may know more by the end of the day, but very, very uncertain. Bigger picture, I see little evidence, despite the real harm that is being caused to China's economy by the tariffs. And the Chinese economy is slowing, there's no question. Tariffs are having an impact. But no evidence that Beijing is willing to change course. Instead, the government there has taken a variety of measures to offset the negative impacts of the U.S. tariffs, including increasing its infrastructure spending, ordering banks to provide more low-cost loans to businesses, increasing its refund tax for exports, decreasing tariffs on imports from other countries. Chad Bown of the Peterson Institute did a great piece of research on this, looking at how the Chinese are cutting tariffs on other countries even as they're raising them against the United States. And we talked about exchange rates this morning, allowing the yuan to devalue to try to offset some of the negative impact of the tariffs. And the Chinese government is whipping up its own nationalism, with the press constantly exhorting the Chinese people to stand up to American bullying. And if you've been following what's going on with Hong Kong and the National Basketball Association, the Chinese seem to be ramping this up more and more and more, trying to use the power of their market and their influence over the Chinese people to counter what's coming from the United States. It is certainly possible that the growing weakness in the trade-affected sectors of the U.S. economy might persuade President Trump to cut a weak deal that doesn't address any of the core concerns like technology transfer or Chinese subsidies to state-owned enterprises, to take a weak deal and declare victory. The latest suggestions are that about a third of the economy right now is in recession. The manufacturing economy is clearly suffering, both because of tariffs by other countries that have blocked U.S. manufacturing exports and, as was suggested this morning, the higher price of inputs because of those tariffs. And the farm sector here is clearly hurting badly as well. So there's economic reasons for the president to want to do a deal. But to me, the politics of this really just do not make sense. I think President Trump would much rather go into the next election, say he is holding out for a great deal with China, and that China is hoping he will lose because a Democratic president would be weaker in the negotiations. To my mind, the real question is, will we see further escalation? We've got two key dates to watch. One is October 15, when U.S. tariffs are set to go from 25% to 30% on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports, mostly intermediate manufactured goods of one sort or another. And then the big kahuna, December 15th, when the administration is scheduled to impose a 15% tariff on the remainder of Chinese imports, about $160 billion of almost exclusively consumer products. Tim Cook of Apple has been visiting the White House every couple of weeks, it seems to me, because on that last list will be Apple's iPhones. And they have no plan B, right? They don't have a large production capacity outside China. So if they get hit in that final tranche, it's really, really going to hurt the company. So there's a lot of pressure on the White House not to do this last tranche. Looking forward to the next election, if the president is reelected, he will certainly double down on a highly nationalist trade, and I would say immigration as well, policy, seeing the vote as vindication that the American people support his core beliefs. I go into this in more detail in the new version of my book, but if you look at President Trump's history, this is all consistent. And President Trump has been talking about trade in the same way since the mid-1980s. These are not new ideas for him. He's been a nationalist and a protectionist on these issues for decades now. If President Trump's reelected, trade wars will become the status quo. They may blow hot and cold, depending on the state of the economy. And the result of that is that companies are going to have to build in costly cushions in production and sourcing to deal with the high level of uncertainty. I mean, in the slides this morning, you saw the link between tariffs and supply chains. And part of the reason that this era of globalization was so successful was companies were able to single source products from places where they could be produced in the most cost-efficient way, cut their inventories down to the maximum, rely on just-in-time delivery. In a world where tariffs may go up and down quite randomly, you can't do that. Companies are going to have to build in cushions, and that's going to hit their profit margins. I don't think any of this changes, obviously, even if a Democrat is elected. Elizabeth Warren, if you look at the trade policy she's put up on the website Medium, has staked out an equally hawkish position on trade with China. I think she would work more closely with U.S. allies like the EU and Canada, but in terms of China, her position very similar to the president. If we take a step back from the narrower world of trade, I think what is playing out with China was in many ways entirely predictable. And on this, I think my former professor Ken Waltz was closer to the truth than my other former professor Ernie Haas. Whatever the real mutual benefits that U.S.-China trade brings to both countries, their size, their geopolitical position, and their different forms of government make them rivals. From a trade perspective, China's growing technological sophistication may not pose that much of a threat. I mean, a China that's getting richer and more productive is a better market for U.S. products. But from a security perspective, China's economic and technological progress does indeed pose a threat. Regardless of who becomes the next president, the U.S. security relationship with China is going to loom increasingly large. If we want in the question and answers, we can talk about some of the other things the administration has been doing with regard to China that are not purely trade, including restrictions on foreign investment, tightening of export controls, visa restrictions on Chinese scientists, all of which are part of an effort to cripple China's technological advancement and try to prevent its rise as a geopolitical threat to the United States. Okay, so after that, let me go to the other extreme, trade peace and a revitalized WTO. So under this scenario, the Trump years proved to be an anomaly on trade. I think this is most likely if Joe Biden were to become the U.S. president in 2021, and there might be an effort to revert to something close to the pre-2017 status quo on trade rules. So that would include the United States seeking to rejoin the TPP, some revised version of the USMCA with Canada and Mexico. The Democrats would clearly want tweaks, but if it doesn't get approved this fall, you could say, well, the Biden administration will probably manage to get it through the Congress. Perhaps there would be a new run at a U.S.-European trade deal, and there would be a serious effort to deal with the issues in the WTO dispute settlement system, which I know we're going to talk more about today, to address concerns that actually predate the Trump administration. Concerns over the appellate body in particular are not unique to this administration. Let me just say I think the odds against this are very large. The Trump years have been so head-spinning that it's easy to forget that the trade system was in a lot of trouble before he ever set foot in the Oval Office. The WTO is largely gridlocked, with only minor successes in updating rules over the past 2 decades. Even if the dispute settlement system can be tweaked successfully, it's going to become less and less relevant unless the underlying rules can be updated. I mean, most current WTO rules, after all, were written in the late 80s and early 90s, which was before the internet was even invented. So every year that goes by, those rules become less relevant to current reality. I may have liked the TPP. I did like the TPP, but President Obama's version was dead on arrival in Congress. And while public opinion seems to be somewhat more favorable to trade these days, that has not influenced the parties in Washington. So I really don't think we can put Humpty Dumpty back together. We're not, post-Trump, whenever that happens, going to go back to the pre-Trump trade world. So let me talk about my final scenario, which I think has the virtue of being both plausible and I would say somewhat optimistic. I don't want to depress you for the whole day here. There may be a third way between the old binding rules and the new trade wars. This would mean, roughly speaking, and you got a hint of it in the morning session, would mean, roughly speaking, going back to the pre-WTO world, in which there were rules and norms for trade, but enforcement was essentially optional. Under the GATT system, countries could complain when they felt rules had been violated, and the panels would issue decisions. But member states, even if they were found to have broken the rules, were free either to abide by those decisions or to ignore them as they saw fit. Unilateral action was largely accepted, and countries would try to negotiate creative compromises that recognize those political realities. A sort of prime example being the U.S. did a series of deals with Japan over the 1970s and 1980s in which Japan agreed to voluntarily restrain its exports of steel and autos and television sets and other products to the United States. It was an ugly compromise, and the WTO abolished those kinds of gray market measures, but it reflected somewhat the political realities of the situation. In addition to that sort of flexibility today, there would have to be greater scope for national security-based actions. Not unlimited scope, but greater scope. In the old system, since it was primarily a creature of the Western Alliance, there was nothing that prevented the United States and its European allies from restricting trade with the Soviet bloc, and we did so. A very comprehensive system of export controls intended to keep our best technologies from getting into the hands of the Soviets. In the current world, however, China is both an extremely important trading partner for the United States and the West and a potential security threat. The rules are going to have to be flexible enough to accommodate that duality. There would also have to be ways to make negotiating progress, to update rules as technology moves forward and economies change. I mean, the WTO, you know this, is experimenting with plurilateral negotiations of one sort or another that involve only some of the member countries. I think there are some reasons to think that can be a way forward. There's clearly lots of scope for continued bilateral and regional deals. My CFR colleague Shannon O'Neill has a great column in Bloomberg this week pointing out that even while the U.S. is not much interested in moving forward on deals these days, the rest of the world is doing so. And these deals have a variety of dispute resolution mechanisms. Again, a kind of more flexible, less coherent system, but a lot better than trade wars. But, and this is a big but, such a system would only be reasonably stable if the major economies, hopefully having recognized the damage caused by the trade wars of the last couple of years, behaved in a restrained fashion in rejecting panel decisions, that they tried to abide by these WTO rulings whenever it was politically possible to do so, and similarly were restrained in resorting to national measures. Even though there was nothing legally in the system that said you can't use Section 301, that a country like the United States and other big powers would be cautious and prudent in doing so. The default would need to be consistency with the rules of the WTO and other trade agreements, with exceptions only for compelling reasons. So can we get there? I would like to say with confidence that the world will find a way to arrive at this middle ground, but it will not be easy. International economic cooperation requires leaders who can look beyond immediate benefits, both political and economic, to consider the long-term gains from stability and predictability. This is especially true for the great powers. And here I mean primarily the United States and China, though Europe economically I think is also a great power. Smaller countries are much happier in a rules-based system. I mean, ask the Canadian ambassador, he will tell you this. But bigger countries have the constant temptation of thinking that they can do better by throwing their weight around. I mean, President Trump has made it absolutely clear that he thinks the United States was a patsy and a dupe for decades for not behaving in a narrow, self-interested way until he came to office. That U.S. concern about the stability of the system and fealty to the rules and being worried about benefits of other countries, that's for suckers, right? We should play for maximum gains for the United States. But the only way that such systems can be stable is if the great powers refrain from using their power to pursue only these kinds of short-term gains. Compromise takes a significant degree of trust among countries. And if I'm honest, I think that's sorely lacking at the moment. You know, going back to the United States and Japan in the 1980s and 1990s, for all of their differences on trade, Japan was dependent on the United States for security. Both sides had compelling reasons to limit trade escalation and find compromises. I remember in that Whistler press conference, it got so heated that I stood up and I asked Ambassador Cantor and Mr. Hashimoto, I said, is this getting so bad that these economic disputes might begin to threaten U.S.-Japanese security cooperation? They immediately backed off. Like, no. The U.S. and Japan, friends and allies forever. You know, this is an economic conflict among friends, but it doesn't change the core of our alliance. This is obviously not so true with the United States and China, which are at the very least rivals for global influence. It is much easier and more popular for both countries to play the nationalist card and to keep on escalating. I'm afraid that we are learning once again the lesson we learned from the 1930s and should never have forgotten. Trade wars are not good and easy to win. They are bad and very hard to win, and I might add very hard to stop. You know, the first rule of holes is stop digging. But once you get into trade war, the temptation to keep digging is very large. So I hope that we have the wisdom to find new and better ways going forward. I think conferences like this one, we've got colleagues who are in Geneva at the WTO Public Forum. I think the more that we can educate ourselves about what's going on, talk to our members of Congress, to our political leaders, we may find a way out of this. But it is a difficult moment on this whole set of issues. So I'd be happy to open it up, take questions, or people can argue with me vociferously if they wish to. Thanks very much.
Hi there. First of all, thank you for coming to our humble state of Nebraska to share your expertise. My question kind of piggybacks off your argument that it will take a restraint of the major powers moving forward to progress in kind of a international trade system that works. Yeah. What do you see it taking for China to see the benefit in abiding by those international standards?
That is a great question. There will need to be an accommodation that recognizes the legitimacy of China's state-led economic model. So, as I said, the GATT system was a creature of the Western alliance. It was designed by and for economies that more or less operated the same way. And I'm not saying all the WTO members operate this way, but the ones that matter, the United States, Europe, Canada, Japan, the big players, all organize their economies in roughly similar ways, in which the private sector is the major economic actor, the government role is more modest. Government intervenes in various ways, but there are ways to talk about and control. China has a state-directed model in which the purpose at the end of the day is the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Everything else is secondary to that. The function of economic growth in the Chinese system is not so much to make the Chinese people better off, though it has, but to maintain the legitimacy of Communist Party leadership. And the current rules don't deal with that well. There's a brilliant article by Mark Wu of Harvard called The China Inc. Challenge to Global Governance, which I think anybody in a law school interested in these issues, that's an absolute must read. And he goes into detail about the ways in which China's particular forms of support for its companies, not just the state-owned enterprises, but private companies in China as well, were a sort of clever workaround on the WTO rules. The WTO just wasn't written in a way that really envisioned that sort of support system from the state and wasn't really very well equipped to deal with it. So you're actually going to need some kind of negotiation. And I had been hopeful when the US-China talks started that that's what this would be, that finds an accommodation that says, okay, China, you do organize your economy differently, and there are a lot of things we don't like about it. But we have to recognize you're not becoming more like us, right? The fantasies of the 1990s and the early 2000s when China came into the WTO, that the rise of the private sector would mean there was the rise of groups pushing for greater political liberty, and China over time would come to look more like us. That did not happen. China, if anything, has come to look less like us in the last decade. So the question is, can there be an accommodation which says, okay, your system's different, we don't like it, but it's legitimate. You have the right to organize your economy this way. The question for us is, what can we, the West, do to minimize the negative impacts on us of the way you have organized your economy? Protecting from export surges, dealing with intellectual property theft, other issues like that. I don't know whether that's possible, but it can't be a winner-take-all arrangement. The great powers are going to have to find a way to accommodate themselves. And as I said, I had hoped that, and Lighthizer a serious guy, he's a serious negotiator. I had some hope that these US-China negotiations would do so, but I think, unfortunately, I don't think the administration is very well organized. The president inserts himself in this stuff periodically in ways that I think are quite damaging to the coherence of the US negotiating position, and we haven't got there this way. Maybe there's another way to do it, but that's where we need to get to. Yeah. There's some backup here, Jill, or yeah.
try again. I'd be interested in kind of talking about this lack of certainty. People are still having to make moves. I mean, individual actors, businesses, leaders. What is your kind of thought or advice, if you would hazard it, in such a state of uncertainty? How do you decide, or what criteria to use on day-to-day actions and movements?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the project I'm currently working on, I'm just beginning to try to think that through a little more. Part of the problem is it differs greatly from sector to sector, and so it's hard to give general advice. I mean, if you take something like textiles and clothing, it's a highly mobile industry, right? I mean, most of the clothing we wear, it comes from subcontractors in developing countries. Sometimes, it can be, small little facilities with half a dozen people at sewing machines, and others are much larger. But that's quite mobile. So, right, if the U.S. is slapping high tariffs on clothing exports from China, it's not that hard to reconfigure supply chains to get your clothing from Bangladesh or India or Vietnam or somewhere else. You're seeing the surge in exports from Vietnam is the mobile sectors at least hedging by moving some of their operations out of China into Vietnam in order to avoid the tariffs. And I can't tell you kind of sector by sector how that's happening. I don't kind of have the big picture yet. I know in some areas, like production of Apple iPhones, that's very hard, right? The combination of the skilled labor and the capital investment you need to do that. You can't just pick up Foxconn in Shenzhen and move it to Vietnam. So it's much harder. I think a general, and I'd really be interested in hearing from people in this, maybe we will over the course of the day, people in business or people in the agriculture sector. I think you're having to build in redundancy, right? So, if you're a farmer, and again, my brother farmed for many years, but on a very small scale, so I'm far from an expert on this. But, if you've got all of your eggs in the China basket, literally in the case of dairy, not so literally in the case of soybean and other products, that's not where you want to be, right? You want to be diversifying your markets internationally, potentially even if you take a bit of a profit hit, because there's a real vulnerability in relying on a single market. And I suspect a lot of farmers are doing that sort of thing. So I think what's going to have to happen as a general rule is people doing business internationally are going to have to build in redundancies. And that's just expensive, right? It means you're not looking every place to maximize profit. You're as worried about security of supply and security of market opportunity as you are about profit margins by making sure you're getting the best product at the lowest cost. And companies are not going to like that, but I don't think they have any choice. I think that's the only way to deal with this kind of uncertainty. I mean, the other option is to lobby the heck out of it and hope that the politicians change their mind. And I think both those things are going on, right? So, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to go back to what you had mentioned previously about the United States and China obviously having very different economic systems. When it comes to the negotiations and resolving the current dispute that we have right now, the sense that I get is that in order for this dispute to be resolved, there needs to be essentially wholesale structural changes in the way China approaches United States businesses, the way that we operate in that country, the way they interact with us. Do you see that is that what needs to happen? And if so, what's the likelihood of China embracing those structural changes in order for a trade deal to be reached?
I mean, I think that's what the U.S. wants. If you look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in China wish list, it's massive structural reform in the Chinese economy. And the answer is no, I don't think you get that. I mean, I think in discrete areas, they made offers, as I say, in financial services and some other areas. I think in discrete areas, they are willing to change. But, I mean, what does the U.S. really want? Well, we want China to rely on us for their high technology imports, not to make a drive for global leadership in semiconductors and other sectors, because we have a comparative advantage in that. You could go back to the 80s, and for a while it looked like the Japanese had a comparative advantage in that. But I mean, the Chinese see this as, they see their economic development, they see their technological development as integral to assuming the place they want to assume on the world stage. I mean, I'm not one of those who believes that the Chinese want to supplant the United States as the dominant global power. I don't think their ambitions reach that far. But they certainly would like to be something close to an equal and with dominant influence in their region, in Asia, and tentacles reaching into Africa and other places. And you're not going to change those things through trade negotiations. So I think the question, I'm getting back to my answer, is what's a reasonable accommodation? You know, what are the changes that China can make that make it tolerable for U.S. companies to continue to do business there, that are consistent with U.S. national security concerns? I mean, going back, if I haven't been provocative enough already, I think the U.S. government was deeply irresponsible for allowing companies, U.S. companies, to decide what technologies they were and weren't going to share with the Chinese. And a lot of corporate leaders I've talked to said they hated it, they felt pressured. The Chinese were like, well, if you want access to our market, you've got to share your leading technologies. The U.S. government, in a way, put them in an impossible position. The U.S. government should have been controlling those technologies and saying, look, a lot of those were developed with U.S. taxpayer-supported research funding. And you, the company, do not have complete proprietary control over who you share this technology with, because it has long-term implications for U.S. economic competitiveness and U.S. national security. And I actually think if the U.S. government had done that in a comprehensive way, the companies would have said thank you. They wouldn't have up front. They would have said you're interfering in the private sector. But it would have meant they didn't have to deal with this kind of Faustian bargain, where if you want access to the Chinese market, you've got to give up the crown jewels to a Chinese competitor who's eventually going to supplant you. So we're going to have to think all that stuff through. What are we willing to share with the Chinese? What are we not willing to share? I think some of what's being done on export controls is long overdue. I mean, we may have different opinions about Huawei, but we clearly don't want Huawei to have free reign, right? There needs to be some element of control there. And I think we're going to have to work that out. So the bargain being, the Chinese are going to change not this much. They're probably going to change this much. And if that's so, what do we and the other Western countries have to do to protect ourselves to operate in a global system where the Chinese are only willing to change that much? And that gets back to sort of my other points about there's probably got to be more scope for unilateral action. You can't rely on the WTO to enforce a set of rules that's going to deal with the broader security concerns that the U.S. and others have. So I know that's not a totally satisfying answer, but I think that's the direction at least. Yeah.
Building off the last two questions and your responses to them, there's been some thought about if China's not willing to make significant adjustments, can it really work within a WTO framework with China? So two things you see in the press. One is, although there's no kick-out clause in the WTO, there is a provision where countries can agree to an amendment, and if the amendment is of such a character that they think countries really have to join it, they can, in essence, invite the other country to withdraw or remain by consensus. So that's one thought that you see out there. The other thought is more managed trade with China. You know, if we're not going to get the massive structural reforms, if we're not really playing by the same set of rules, and this sort of gets back to Japan-U.S. talks in the 80s, right? So just your thoughts on the managed trade idea and the, although it's not a kick-out clause, this we're going to amend the rules on subsidies to state-owned enterprises, and if you don't go along with it, we're going to try and get you out.
Yeah, I mean, I theoretically possible. My CFR colleague Jennifer Hillman has thought about this at a deeper level than I have. But you look at the political realities, right? If you actually went in front of the WTO, and the United States on one side is saying kick out China, and China on the other side is saying kick out the United States. Well, you add up the rest of the world, China's actually a more important market for most of those countries now than the United States is. So the notion that somehow we're going to get consensus support in the WTO to kick out China, I mean, that's a complete misreading of the current moment of history, right? I mean, we're still the world's greatest power, but relatively, right, we're heading down, they're heading up. And in market terms, they're a lot more important market for a lot of countries than we are. So I just don't even think that's on the table. So I think then you're looking at the other thing, which is some form of managed trade in which there's a role for the WTO, but there are also a whole bunch of other tools to try to deal with the complicated economic relationship that we have with China. And just recognize that there's no system of international rules that's going to comfortably accommodate the Chinese economic model and the Western economic model. They're too different. You can't put them together into a seamless set of rules, and you just got to live with that. And so that, I think, leads you in the managed trade direction.
So obviously the volatility and uncertainty.
Sorry, where am I looking again?
Up
There we
here,
go. Thank
sorry.
you. Yeah.
The volatility and uncertainty of the trade market is painful for really everyone involved right now.
Yeah.
So two-part question. First of all, in your opinion, do you think the U.S. has been missing out or kind of at the losing end of trade the past 10 to 15 years? And the second part is the light at the end of the tunnel of this trade war, possibly worth fixing the intellectual property right loss of a lot of U.S. companies, as well as like the non-tariff barriers. Do you think we can get to a point that is kind of worth this war right now?
Yeah. I mean, let me take the first. I think, and again, there are people in this room who can probably answer that better than I can, but I think, yeah, the U.S. has been losing out. I think, other countries have been far more aggressive in these bilateral and regional deals. I think if we'd stayed in the TPP, you would have argued, well, we've mostly kept pace with the rest of the world. But, the Europeans have done, deals with Japan, deals with Mercosur, deals with Mexico. Mexico's got more free trade agreements than any other country in the world. The Canadians have been very ambitious. Their deal with the EU gives Canadian companies significantly better access in the European market than American companies have. So in terms of market access, I think there's no question the U.S. has been falling behind in the last 10 or 15 years. We basically, with the rejection of the TPP, got out of the bilateral and regional game. I mean, the Japanese deal is sort of a joke, really. And I'm getting back on WTO violations. The Japanese deal is a blatant violation of the WTO as well, because WTO rules say that a free trade deal, in order to be consistent, has to cover substantially all trade. And the new deal with Japan covers a little bit of trade. We don't care anymore as a country whether we violate the WTO, but that's another WTO violation. The second question on will it be worth it, at the end of the day, pretty clearly not, right? And to be fair, as I say at the outset of this, I was somewhat sympathetic, partly because I have respect for Lighthizer negotiating skills. I mean, you couldn't look at the track record through the WTO and say, oh, the WTO has been great at constraining China's disruptive economic practice. It hadn't been. And you can argue that we weren't aggressive enough in using the WTO, and I think we probably weren't, but it hadn't. And so I think there was scope to say a more direct approach might obtain more results. I just think the negotiations have been terribly mishandled. We should have worked closely with our allies to sort of launch a trade war on all fronts, right? The basic strategy tells you don't fight with everybody at the same time, right? Focus on the big problem, which is the problem with China. So have your allies behind you. And then secondly, have a realistic set of goals. Basically, the U.S. put everything on the table. And then when the Chinese didn't say, oh yeah, we'll do it all, we kept escalating. Like somehow, if we stuck the boot on hard enough, they would eventually give. And I'm not a China expert, but I spend a lot of time talking to real China experts. Anyone who understands anything about the history of China, about China's pride, about China's nationalism, could have told you that an approach like that would fail. There had to be some way, and I think this is true, and we've got real trade negotiators here, but I think this is true in any trade negotiation. There has to be some kind of win-win. There has to be something that both sides can walk away with and say we gained. And the way the U.S. approached this negotiation with China made that impossible. And I think there were a lot of tactical blunders, even though I'm sympathetic to the desire to use unilateral tools given the less than stellar results through the WTO in the last 15 years or so.
I don't know. We've had it's over here.
Yes.
We've had an uprising in Hong Kong, which U.S. policy might have been have heartened the protesters in Hong Kong after this overreach. I would call it an overreach, but I want to just comment on one thing and ask your observations about this. The first is that another way of looking at the president's approach is not that he's just an economic nationalist, a unilateralist, but that the point is that systems in place have taken advantage of the United States over an extended period of time, and his objective is to restore a little greater fairness to the United States. And I'd invite your comment on that. The other is that it seems to me that the evidence is overwhelming. We have this enormous body of evidence that we've never seen economic nationalism like we've seen from the PRC. And so if you're dealing with an entity that is openly and notoriously advancing its interests through the use of economic nationalism around the globe, what is the source of your optimism that you can do anything about that from the standpoint of trade negotiations? Or let me ask it a different way.
Yeah.
What should our policy objectives be when we're dealing with an entity like that?
So that is, I mean, let me just take the first part quickly. I do actually think Trump is very clearly an economic nationalist if you look at his history. And I think he's been quite clear about he likes tariffs, right? He thinks tariffs are a great thing for the United States. So I actually don't think, at least from the president's level, it's been as strategic as you suggest. I think Lighthizer has tried to be strategic. But I think if the U.S. really was just about restoring balance, I think, for instance, it'd be much more engaged in the WTO now than it is trying to reform the appellate body process. I think the U.S. is quite clearly willing to let that system become crippled. So I do think there's a lot of economic nationalism underlying it. But your second question is a really good one. And this is a question of who started this. And it's very reasonable to say, well, the Chinese started this, that they behaved in an aggressively nationalist, narrow, self-interested way with no particular concern for the stability of the system. And I think that is true. And historically, that's what tends to happen, right? Rising powers are very slow to recognize their responsibility for system stability. They're much more, well, that's kind of the system, and we don't really want to get tied up in that. I mean, we've got that history in the United States, right? I mean, remember our period between the two world wars where we had the economic and military muscle to make a big difference in terms of world order, and we decided we didn't want to do that, right? We didn't want to play that game. And so the Chinese, in that sense, quite similar, very focused on what their gains are. I think their arguments would be, if you talk to them, well, we're a poor country, we're still a poor country, we've got all of this gap to make up with the United States, it's really okay for us to be behaving in this way. And I think clearly it wasn't, right? Because China was so large that it had system disruptive effects. And a lot of what we're dealing with is the consequence of that. So I think I agree with you, I think you can blame a lot of this on the way the Chinese have behaved. The question of optimism, look, if I'm really candid, I'm not very optimistic, right? I think U.S.-China relations are going to get worse and worse and worse. I think doing business in China is going to get more and more uncomfortable for American companies. I think, you speak of Hong Kong, the aggressive Chinese response to one silly tweet by one NBA general manager, tells you they're getting bolder and bolder and trying to push back. Now, they may overreach, and that may have negative consequences for the Chinese economy, and then maybe there's some room. But I think at the moment, I think the likelihood for accommodative negotiations is pretty low.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you. To follow up on the Secretary of State's question, and specifically with regard to China, Xi Jinping has been watching his economy decelerate rather substantially. He cares about nothing more than the stability of the party and the security of the party. At what point does he say enough is enough, and does he roll over? And does he acquiesce to the U.S.?
I guess I really... I'm not a China expert. I take some of my cues from people like Scott Kennedy at CSIS, who I think is brilliant on this stuff. I think that the Chinese only roll over to the point that they don't see it as a fundamental challenge to their economic model. And I think anything that retards their drive for technological progress, I think anything that fundamentally undermines state support for their companies, I think that's a step too far. I think the Chinese would eagerly do a smaller deal. We'll buy a heck of a lot more soybeans, and we'll do some more things to protect U.S. investments in some sectors. I think they'd be delighted for a partial deal like that. I think the problem there is on the U.S. side. Can this administration live with a deal like that? Because the president has set expectations very high. He's going to do a great deal that's going to solve these problems. Now, he can do a deal and call it whatever he wants, and so it's not impossible. But I don't think the Chinese roll over at the end of the day. I think they're willing to do a certain degree, like I said, not here, but here, and the question is whether the U.S. can live with that or not. So far, we haven't been willing to live with that. Could change, and again, we're moving into, 2020 election, and the president's got to make those calculations. So I think it's possible that we will see some kind of placeholder deals that'll cool the temperature for a little while, but I don't think these big kind of tectonic rivalries, that's going to go on. It's going to be a challenge of our generation, right?
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Please join me.